Hey, happy Monday afternoon. Dr. Alan Christensen here with you for another episode of Office Hours Live. Here we are coming into the holiday season already. Good to be with you. Yeah, welcome to Office Hours Live. So with this, I'll always have a few topics to cover, but the big thing is your questions. It's fun to have a detailed conversation and, take things to greater levels of depth. That's been a real theme of my work, is not just how do we find the basic facts you could find anywhere, but how do you understand things in ways that really apply to you personally? Holistic core wellness, good to see you too. Good to have you aboard and welcome. Glad you could join me today. And I'm just keeping track. So I'm with you guys right now on a couple platforms, managing my volume. Okay. Yep, with you on Instagram, on YouTube, and Facebook Live. Hey, Lana, good to see you too. Nice to see you here with us this afternoon. One of my cousins is here with us, which is really cool. So yeah, I had a couple of topics to mention. And, in terms of questions to ask, thyroid stuff is always straightforward and easy. Endocrine topics, hormone replacement therapy type issues, diabetes, blood sugar metabolism, weight loss, adrenal health, those are the big ones. So yeah, things along those lines, happy to help sort those things out. Another thing that I like to do with these is I like to focus on threads. So when I see related questions, I'll often pick up on those. And also I love follow-up questions. So if you put a question up, hang out, I'll probably be able to answer it. And I'll probably have some follow-up questions. Something I've realized is that it's one thing to answer a question, but I can think of very specific circumstances in my life where this has happened, is that the best people that have the best information, when I ask them a question, they question my question because I may not be asking the best question. So they'll have a conversation with me and I'll realize that I just didn't really understand it well enough, or that the direction that my question implied me going might not have been the best direction to go. So yeah, so your friends will answer your questions, but your truest friends will question your questions. So yeah, I'll probably question a few of the questions, and stick around so you can help answer those, and we'll go back and forth and get a good dialogue going. So a couple of topics I had queued up, and one that I was hearing a lot of questions about recently was about keto diets, and keto diets, how they pertain to weight loss. I'm seeing a few requests to join in live video. If I cover a few questions, I've got some time for those later, I'll try that, and it's always gone well. So hang tight. If I can get to that in 10-15 minutes, I'll see if I can't do that. That's on one of the platforms. So yeah, so keto diets and weight loss. So the general idea, the popular concept that's out there, is that when you're in ketosis, your body is burning fat for fuel. And the thought is that this starts a reaction that will help you burn large amounts of fat from your body. That's the general idea. And it's not quite correct. So the issue is that ketosis is not when you're burning fat for fuel. It's when you cannot burn fat for fuel. That's when your body enters into a different state called ketosis. Here's a little background biochemistry to make sense out of this. So our body has different fuels, fats, carbs, ketones, alcohol. They're the main fuel molecules, and they're all containing a compound called oxaloacetate. And at the level of your liver, any source of oxaloacetate is basically interchangeable. One is not radically different from the next. But what happens is we burn fuel in different ways, and the preferred fuels our body uses are fats and carbs. And carbs are stored as triglycerides or glycogen. Fats are stored as triglycerides. So when we burn fat, this is a process called beta oxidation. And it needs carbohydrate. We need some glycogen, some glucose to burn carbohydrate effectively. Now, there's times in where the total fuel that we have available is less than what our body needs. That's when we're going to burn into our fuel stores. And if we have available glycogen, we'll also break down fat stores. If we cannot break down fat stores for one reason or another, then we can go into a state called ketosis. So with ketosis, we're converting triglycerides into ketones. It's not burning them, it's converting them. You're basically turning dollars to pesos. It's still currency. and the value is interchangeable, so to speak. It's only when one is ketogenic and at a fuel deficit that the body can burn something that's stored. So yeah, ketosis is not burning fat. Ketosis is converting fat into ketones. And if your food intake, your total food intake, is above your body's requirements, it doesn't matter if you're in ketosis. You will not lose weight. You can actually gain weight quite easily on that. So it always takes a food deficit. And it's kind of surprising, but there are some nuances in how body composition changes based upon what kind of fuel we're burning. So if we are burning more ketones, we have to use protein to run that equation. So we can burn fats and carbs without having to sacrifice protein. But when we burn ketones, we do need a lot of protein to power that. So one of the last well-controlled studies looked at people who were on ketogenic diets or on the same amount of food on, honestly, a lot of junk food. It was a highly processed carbohydrate diet. That was like half the calories. And it was the same amount of calories, however. What they saw was that the difference in terms of fat loss, there was more fat loss on the diet burning processed carbs than on the diet burning ketones. And neither one was set up to try to make people lose weight. It was just making it equal for the caloric load. But yeah, many were surprised to see that the ketogenic diet didn't equate to substantial fat loss. And that's because there was a lot of protein lost in that. So there was a great deal of muscle wasting. Okay, I've been babbling on for a bit about that. Seeing a lot of you guys jumping on, welcome here, welcome aboard. With you on Instagram and on Facebook and on YouTube. And I had one request for a live one wanted to join video live. That's on one of these platforms, and I'll do my best to relay that information for those on the others. But let's just see how this goes. And it could be someone who's just a spammer, and I'll just drop them right away. But that really hasn't happened. It's generally been people that are very sincere and have good questions. So let's see what we got. I will welcome Carl. Who is this? Let's see. I got to back up just a little bit. Here we go. This looks like it's from Jackie. I will invite Jackie on and see if she wants to come on and say hello, and if she's got a relevant question for us. So this might take just a moment or two, but I did accept that request. Okay, so if that happens, I'll jump on. In the meantime, I will keep talking about this. So what else would ketogenic diets do if they're not effective for weight loss? Well, there's talk about them being useful for brain function, for cognitive function, for epilepsy, and we do have good data on that. They have been shown to be effective for helping epileptic episodes in children who do not respond to medications. I was an epileptic kid myself, and I was on Dilantin and phenobarbital. The meds are harsh. Oh, we do have Jackie joining us here. Did I get the name right, Jackie?
You did, yes.
Hey, welcome. So yeah, you're with us live. We're on a couple of platforms. And was there a question for office hours that you had today, or?
I actually do.
Okay, let's see what you got.
So, I'm Hashimoto's. I've been on medication for a really long time.
Okay.
7 years, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
26 years. And I do combination T3, T4.
Mm-hmm.
My TSH has been between probably 0.01 and 0.02.
Mm-hmm.
Probably for the last, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years. And I've done a lot of different medication adjustments, taking it down, especially since menopause. I keep going down, keep going down, keep going down, and the TSH does not budge.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, number one,
Why won't it budge?
Yeah, and do I move the T3 or the T4 medication, or both?
Let me bring the other audiences up to speed, because some can hear us directly and some can't. So I'll do a quick recap. And you can also confirm if I got the general story right. And then I'll ask a few more follow-up questions here. So Jackie, you've been on thyroid meds for 27 years, you said. You're on T3 and T4. Your TSH is between 0.01, 0.02. It's below range. And it's been hard to get that to change. You've adjusted medication, but it's not really responded. So the question, and probably a talking point too, is, is this relevant? Is it a concern to have the TSH below range? Many argue very strongly that it's not a problem. There are some who seem to feel better when the TSH is a little bit below range, and many argue that it's perfectly safe. There's no drawbacks to that. So, yeah. So, and you mentioned about not sure if it's a matter of changing the T3 or the T4. So let's do some background math here. So one more point that I didn't mention, just for the rest of the audience, is you said this was for Hashimoto's. It was for Hashimoto's disease. When you were first diagnosed back when, do you remember what your scores were, or if they said like what category you were in, or?
No.
That's okay.
Yeah. This is before I got, long ago, before functional medicine, and I just basically, they told me what I had.
Take this pill and, yeah.
Take this pill every day for the rest of your life, and, then you morph into different stages. You don't feel well, you go back to the doctor, they adjust your medication, la-di-da-di-da.
Okay. So it wasn't clear on where things were back when, and that's not uncommon. So your medications now, so which ones are you on? What are the dosages?
So I'm on Levoxyl.
Okay.
And I take it in a weird way. So I take 137 5 days a week, and I take half of that 2 days a week.
Okay. And then also on T3, you said?
I take 15 micrograms of liothyronine every day.
Okay. So the first thing I always think about is, let's put these in common units. And let's bring everyone else up to speed in case they couldn't hear you. So you're on Levoxyl 135 on weekdays, half of the dose on weekends, and then on 137.
Yeah,
You did 137 5 days, and then leothyronine, generic Cytomel, for 15 micrograms total. So a couple of just quick thoughts, and this wouldn't really apply to where your scores are now, but are you on generic Cytomel or on Cytomel?
I'm on generic.
This is for everyone. So thyroid meds, we've got active ingredients and inactive ingredients. Now, the inactive ingredients in thyroid medications differ a lot from different manufacturer, from brand to brand. In most cases, they're not a problem when you're on the same medicine. If the inactive ingredients make you absorb, and I'm making this up, maybe they make you absorb 10% less. If you're always on the same thing, you and your doctor can make sense out of that. You can adjust it to compensate, and it can be fine. But if your brands are changing or the inactive ingredients are changing, it's always different whenever you refill. So that's one drawback about generics, is that they're the same for active ingredients, but they're not the same for inactives. And there's many different manufacturers for generics. So when you refill that, you may get the same thing from a different manufacturer, and it wouldn't have the same inactive ingredients that it had last time around. So for some people, their levels don't stay very steady for that reason. And it's just tough to calibrate, because those differences can bounce up and down in ways that you would not predict. And that's not enough to explain where your scores are now. So the 15 micrograms of T3, so let's put this into common units. There's a concept that I've talked about called T4 equivalency. So whenever someone's on like natural thyroid or T4 or T3, we want to get to like common units to make sense of what your total dose is like. So for T3, the factor is roughly 4 times. So each microgram of T3 is about 4 times the potency as T4. So we'll call that 15 micrograms of leothyronine 60 micrograms for T4 equivalencies. Now the 137 times 5 plus the half of the dose, so the half of that is 65. So you're going to be on pretty close to 125 micrograms for a daily average. And I could run an exact number. It won't be too far from that. So if we were to combine that with that 60, you're getting about 185 micrograms of T4 potency on a daily average. Did that all make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not saying that it would work the exact same way as 185 of T4 every day, but just to think about what the total potency is. That's a good way to think about that. If you wish to share, it's your call either way. I can tell you how this would have compared to what your body's needs were. So for example, if a woman was 160 pounds and she was menopausal, postmenopausal, not on hormones, she would need somewhere around 6 to 8 tenths of a microgram of T4 per pound of body weight. So math in my head, that would be for a woman that size, that would be roughly 120 micrograms of T4. So what that means is if a woman like that lacked a thyroid, that's about how much she would be expected to need for a replacement dose. Would you wish to share like a ballpark weight or?
Sure.
Okay.
130.
Okay.
And I'm postmenopausal.
And you didn't say, but are you on any kind of hormone replacement therapy or?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now I ask about
Compounded. Yep. Estrogen and progesterone.
So I ask about that. There's a compound called thyroid binding globulin, and the amount of estrogen in your body is proportionate to how much thyroid binding globulin is in your body. So women that are menstruating, women that are on hormones, women that are on oral contraceptives, they always have some higher load of estrogen than a postmenopausal woman would if she were not on hormones, or that a guy would have. And that makes your body need a little bit more thyroid hormone. In those cases, it's about 9 tenths of a microgram per pound. So at 130 pounds, so what, 130 minus 13, so 117, 120, probably around 120 micrograms is what we would expect your body would need. So that's super helpful. So you're taking a daily dose of 185 micrograms right now, and your scores show your TSH is below range. I would guess your T3 and T4 are not elevated above range.
No.
Yeah.
They're normal.
Yeah. And this stymies a lot of doctors, just to catch everyone else up who might not have heard some of that. So Jackie is taking about 185 micrograms of thyroid per day. Her TSH is below range, but her T3 and T4 are not elevated. And this is a funny thing. There's so many ways in which the body works that make sense, only when you get an odd way that it makes sense. When you get more thyroid than you need, there's a series of events that take place. The first one is your body shuts down your production of thyroid hormone. And that occurs by the pituitary lowering the TSH. You're telling your thyroid, hey, just knock it off because we've got too much. When that happens, a lot of other things go on behind the scenes, several of which are your body gets rid of thyroid hormones faster. You quite literally pee and poop them out in a greater degree than you would otherwise. You also break them down more quickly. You package them up by your liver, and your cells quit responding to them. Your cells barricade themselves and don't absorb them quite as readily. So you're kind of like digging in your heels and fighting against thyroid hormone. And some people, they could take a little too much at that stage, and they can have symptoms like they're getting too little. Like some could talk about fatigue or weight resistance or hair thinning, things like that. And they think, how could this happen if I'm taking too much? How could I feel like I'm hypothyroid? But it actually can happen, not because there's a lack of thyroid, but because the body is fighting the thyroid. And that's really common at the stage where the TSH is low, but the free hormones haven't gone up. Now, just to make a silly example, if we took a clone of yours and gave her like 10 times your dose, your T3 and T4 would go above range. There's a point where your body just can't bail that ship fast enough and they start to overaccumulate. You're not there, so you're able to get rid of that excess. And oftentimes that prevents you from having obvious hyperthyroid symptoms. Some can still have them, but they're usually not as obvious and not as severe at this stage. It's possible to have no symptoms, or it's possible to have some hypothyroid symptoms. Are there any hypo or hyper symptoms that you've been aware of, or you felt that you have going on still, or?
Hair loss.
Okay.
Yeah, I go through stages of pretty bad, like losing a third of my hair every few months, and then it grows back, and then it's fine for a few months, and then it falls out again. But the hair loss is definitely something I notice.
Okay. So a couple of thoughts on that. A lot of things can cause that are not thyroid related. Probably number one is iron status, good thing to think about that way. But TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, it's the signal from pituitary talking to your thyroid. And it does a lot of things besides that. The thyroid stimulating hormone tells your thyroid to work, but also it's telling other cells to do things. So TSH tells your bone cells to grow. It tells the cells that line your blood vessels to repair themselves. It also controls the activity of the follicles. So yeah, the comment was about hair loss. If you didn't hear that she was noticing some hair loss, there can be a connection. And if the TSH is too low, it's not properly governing the follicle turnover cycles. So it's important to realize that there's the effects of too much or too little thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, But TSH has some effects that are not just on your thyroid, and this can be one of those. So yeah, that's a drawback, one of the drawbacks about it being too low. And you may have heard concerns about cardiovascular health or brain health or bone health. Those can also come from a lack of TSH. Those things can all be heightened if there's also an excess of thyroid hormones, but they can start just from the lack of the TSH signaling being present. So in terms of how doses would change and how your blood levels would change, you were on higher doses before, I'm assuming? Yeah.
Yes.
And if you were taking, like, let's say you're taking your exact same dose right now, and your score said you were getting exactly enough, or you were getting too little, we would look at that and say, you're taking 185 equivalent micrograms per day, and we wouldn't expect your body to need much more than 120. So in that case, we'd say, wow, where's that rest of that going? Is your medicine not made well? Are you not absorbing it? Are you not taking it each day? We think all kinds of things like that. But in a case like this, to where you're taking about, a third more than your body would make, and your scores say you're hyper, it makes total sense. No surprise about that. And in terms of which one should you change, this is interesting because doctors think a lot about T3 and T4 levels to determine T3 and T4 doses. But I mentioned before how your body controls those as best it can. So even if you've got too much or too little, your body has its idea about what its set point should be for T3 and T4. So it's nice to have them available, but the amount of them you take doesn't directly affect the level of that particular hormone unless you've got like none or 10 times too much. And only then does it do that. In the past, were you on T4 only, and did you find that you felt better in ways with including T3?
Yes, I had been on T4 only a long time ago, but I've had T3 in my life probably for at least 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. So those that couldn't hear, Jackie did have T3 added in 10, 15 years ago. She found it a helpful change. And a few thoughts on that. That's not unusual. There's tons of good reasons why that can happen. There are many people to where they were never on the best amount of T4, and sometimes it could have worked for them. I only say that to listeners because sometimes that can be simpler and more cost effective. And if it can work for you with fewer pills, they're easier to find, so be it. But there's many to where there is no good amount of T4 only. They're only going to do better if they have some T3 or natural thyroid included. So then questions come up about types and proportions. Did you add in Cytomel, or did you do natural thyroid at some point?
I've done everything.
You've done everything.
I've done everything.
Jackie's done all of it.
Natural, I've been on Tirosint, I've been on, I think, literally every one you can possibly. And for some reason, it's easier to titrate, I think that's the right word.
Yeah.
Between the two, if I separated them, it
Sure.
works better for me.
Sure. Totally valid. Yeah, and some people fall on one that does well. And same story, there are times to where someone they took one type of thyroid medicine and it didn't work well, but when I've worked in depth in person and gone back and looked at things like, oh wow, that just wasn't the right amount. So that happens too. But I would just take that at face value at this point and say, this is probably your best combo overall. In terms of amounts, yeah, your total dose would probably be somewhere around that 120 micrograms per day. And so then we think about like, well, what's the best proportion for you? And there's a lot of different numbers talked about with T3 and T4. So for example, the body excretes, you'll hear numbers of like 80% of what we make is T4, 20% is T3, maybe you hear like 90%, 10%. The truth is your thyroid can adjust that. Your thyroid is able to, when it's working healthy, it can make more of one or more of the other to a point. So it can adjust that and make more or less T3 as it sees fit. Natural thyroid, the T3 and the T4 in pig, in porcine thyroid, is about a 4-to-1 ratio. And there are many that argue that ratio is much higher than humans would have. And the difficulty is you have to figure out which ratio you're talking about. There's the ratio inside the thyroid, there's the ratio that the thyroid secretes, and there's the ratio that people have in circulation. And they're all different numbers. I think the fairest number is the ratio in circulation because many have a hard time doing a good job with conversion. So it's ultimately what you've got circulating that makes the biggest difference. And in those cases, you can think about a ratio of really anywhere from about like 10 to 1 to 4 to 1. They're all pretty reasonable. I do find that T3, when taken in isolation, often can feel a bit more potent than when it's bound up with proteins like in natural thyroid. So when it's separate, we think more about a smaller ratio of T3 to T4. So right now, so the 15 to 165, so that's, 137. So you're somewhere around what, like 8 to 1, 8 to 9 to 1 for the ratio, not an unreasonable ratio. Now, if your total dose was in the ballpark of 120 micrograms of T4, let me just play with one example. So if you had like 90 and 10, if you had like 90 and 10, 88 is what they commonly make. So like an 88, 95 microgram of T4, a 5 to 10 microgram of T3 dose, that would put you about in that range. And it's not worth calculating it to the microgram. It's worth just having a good starting point because your needs will require a bit of personalization. But those are dose ranges that would put you at about what your physiologic need would be. And once you're there, that's about when you'd start seeing the TSH creep back up again. And I see it a lot to where many people have some ongoing symptoms that are unresolved that do better when their TSH is normal again. Not to say elevated, not to say high optimal. All those things are, totally valid. You're better having that down at a good range. And healthier people have TSHs that are on the lower side of normal. So, how long do you think your TSH has been below range like it is now?
A long time.
Long time?
Probably 5 years.
5 years. Okay. So Jackie said her TSH has been below for 5 years or so. Have you had thyroid ultrasounds in the past? Mm-hmm. Any particular findings that were mentioned from those?
Just, normal, like they say it's normal for Hashimoto's.
Okay.
Some deterioration, but no nodules or anything like that.
Okay. So Jackie said her ultrasound said that it was normal enough. There was some Hashimoto's deterioration. They also call that hypoechogenicity, or like a Swiss cheese appearance, like some holes here and there. There's two main kinds of Hashimoto's. There's one where it gets holes and it swells a bit, and one where it shrinks up. The goitogenic and the atrophic. Now, I'm asking these questions because more and more these days, I think about long-term, how much, if someone needs a full dose of thyroid hormones or not. You've been on it for 25 years or so, pretty fair amount for 5 years. And you've got some deterioration from Hashimoto's. I wouldn't think it'd be responsible to say that you don't need thyroid meds. I think it'd be unrealistic to say that. But it wouldn't be unrealistic to think that you may need less than what your body would make. Your body might make some and might contribute. And there are a lot of ways in which it seems that the homemade stuff is better than the store-bought stuff. Whatever you can do on your own can give health benefits that aren't always replicated by replacement therapy. So I always toy with that idea. And the further you can know what you're making by knowing how much you need and how much what you take represents. So to make up an example, let's say that someone just like you was taking roughly a 60 microgram dose of T4. Given that your body would need about 120, you could say, let's assume that this person is stable and they've got enough. We could say, they're making about half. That you're taking about half of what you need and the body is not lacking, so the other half must be coming from you. So you can be aware of that. There's been a lot of data about how likely it is that someone needs a complete dose of thyroid for long term. And if someone's had their gland taken out, or if their gland is completely atrophic and it's all shrunken down to nothing, for sure, that's completely appropriate. That won't change. But apart from those scenarios, the majority of people can have some endogenous output. They can have their thyroid come back and make some more again. It takes having some TSH, not a high amount, but some, because that stimulates the thyroid and tells it to do its job and tells it to work. As I mentioned, it also tells the brain cells to grow. It also tells hair follicles to repair. Something I didn't mention, but it's also relevant for lipolysis, for fat cell breakdown. So when TSH is too low, the body can't really break down fat effectively. So actually fat loss becomes more difficult. At the extremes of excess thyroid hormone, then there's often weight loss, but rarely fat loss. It's mostly muscle and bone loss, which no one really wants. But yeah, it's very common that people can see their thyroid do better. Big thing is having some TSH and then being mindful of just avoiding just some of the extra sources of iodine. Have you been aware of some of my work around that? Or
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, there was one big study in which they had people just do very basic steps of avoiding iodine, and they saw that 88% were able to do well on less thyroid hormone than they were taking before. And that was of those who were severely hypothyroid going into it. So yeah, most can find that happen. But yeah, talk to your doctor. I think that the T3, T4 has been probably the best fit for you, and it'd be a big thing to change types after all that you've gone through. Another question that might come up is, how does one go from a dose that's too high to a dose that's reasonable? Do you do that all at once, or like a stepwise fashion? And there's couple different thoughts. So slowly and gradually, you could ratchet your way down to that. But thyroid hormones, they leave your body pretty slowly. It takes somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks for T4 to leave, and about a week for T3 to leave. And this is kind of funny because we hear about how quickly we absorb the hormones. Like T3 takes a few hours for its blood levels to go up. It actually takes about a day to get a full dose in the bloodstream, but it takes about a week to get it completely out, and much longer for T4. So when you change a dose, your overall levels inside of your body, they don't change immediately. You know, a silly example, if someone was taking a full dose of T4 and they needed it and they stopped completely, their body actually wouldn't run out for about like 4 or 6 weeks. So because of that, it always changes gradually inside of you, even if you change it more abruptly outside of you. So yeah, when I manage someone who is taking a dose that makes them hyperthyroid, I'll often say, let's figure out what your probable replacement dose is. Let's just start at that. Let's go to right there, and certainly keep watching and testing and adjusting as need be. And in those cases, I love to test several times over the course of a couple months and know that it takes about 3 months for the TSH to totally level out, but you should see it start to come up. If it's not budging, you've not moved enough, you know.
Okay.
If it shoots up radically, it was too much. But yeah, you should see it start to come up even in a matter of like 3-4 weeks. So let's say that we wanted your TSH to come up to between 1 and 1.5. And let's say that within a month, it came up to like 0.1 rather than 0.01. So that wouldn't be enough, you know. On the other hand, let's say that in 3 weeks, it was up to 0.6. It'd be very reasonable to say, well, this might coast further on its own, so let's not lower any more than that. Let's just watch it for a bit longer. So yeah, it takes time to come up, and as long as one considers that, you can measure more quickly. And you can then, the plus about that is you can adjust more quickly and spend less time getting it dialed in.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
You're welcome. So Jackie, any follow-up points that are top of mind that I could clarify for you, or?
I don't think so. I think it's just pretty clear to me that I just need to go down. And the hardest part, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, is getting a doctor to understand what you're talking about, you know, and to know how to and agree to changing your dose and all of that. So,
you know,
I'll cross my fingers.
I'll cross mine for you too. By and large, what you're doing is not against the main approaches right now. You know, you're trying to move back to a level that's back to a normal range. So that's less of a fight with doctors.
True. They like your TSH generally at a certain level.
Yeah. And you're taking T4 and T3. Those aren't too weird. It's harder when you're talking about natural thyroid or those that try T3 only, which I'm not a fan of. But what you're taking is not completely out in left field. So I think your odds are better than they could be.
Yeah. I'll find out. I have a doctor's appointment in a couple months. So.
Well, best of luck. And if you think about it, drop back and give us an update at some point.
Thank you so much for all your work. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, Jackie.
Thank you.
Okay. I will let her duck off. And I think, yeah, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to take a peek. My feed is not showing me the Facebook comments and questions. I want to pull those up too and stay on top of those. With you guys on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Instagram. And every now and then someone will come in. So it's kind of cool. The platforms are all different. But one thing about Instagram is that I am able to pull people in on live discussions like that. And they're always fun. They're always useful, and I can get a lot of insight out of that. Okay, so taking a peek. For some reason, my comments are not coming through. I'm directly on Facebook, my page, and I'm also on the studio, and they're not coming in. So, okay. I will just have to make do without those best I can. So I'm seeing some follow-up questions come in about that, and let me just grab these. Okay, someone else made a comment with the hair loss. Sherry said something about that. Yeah, hair loss with thyroid disease. Anytime thyroid levels are not right, if they're above range, below range, that can be a driver for that. There is some data that thyroid antibodies themselves can also be a factor promoting hair loss. There's most data about thyroid peroxidase doing that, more so than anti-thyroglobulin. But even if everything else is normal, it seems that high amounts of thyroid antibodies can be a driver for hair loss as well. Now, other things can do that also. And sometimes someone could have abnormal thyroid levels and hair loss from a cause that's not the thyroid. Other times, these causes can be additive to where they can together contribute to hair loss and make it worse than either would by itself. I mentioned to Jackie that the number one I think about is iron, and that is a huge driver for hair loss, especially diffuse and even. There seems to be some data suggesting that when it is more about thyroid immunity, the hair loss can be more patchy and more in certain regions, but when it is iron or thyroid levels, it's more diffuse and even throughout the hair. So for iron, the first marker to show up that talks about iron being low would be ferritin. That's like the earliest indicator. And there's been some data saying that with thyroid disease, you can have ferritin that's normal, but still below ideal. Now, ferritin is the stored form of iron. It's mostly in the liver. And when it gets exhausted, when it's too low, then eventually iron gets low in the serum. When that gets low, we see that hemoglobin starts to become harder to make. It becomes of poor quality. And eventually the body can't make red blood cells as effectively. But for a long time, all those things are fine, but ferritin, the stored form, is below range. And what we think about in terms of how low it has to get to cause these symptoms, it may be as high as 40 or 50, but still low enough to cause those symptoms. And an odd paradox with thyroid disease is that until that goes back up to 60 or greater, the symptoms may not improve. So it needs to get higher than it got to cause the symptoms to make them go away. Yeah, some need to get ferritin above 60 or even above 100 to really reverse those symptoms. I've got a crazy detailed blog post all about iron and what to do about it and how to make sense of those iron labs. So yeah, check that one out if you're concerned about your iron possibly being a factor. Next up for hair loss I would think about would be cortisol levels. So when the cortisol cycle's not working right, that can also make it harder, especially if we're seeing intermittent hair loss like Jackie talked about, where it's healthy, then every few months there's a great deal of thinning that goes on. Okay. Here's another question that just came in. You know what? This is great. I think this relates to what we were just talking about. So Susie, 1406, said that my free T3 dropped significantly since I started on BHT, biological hormone therapy. Could there be a correlation between the two? There sure could. And now, here's where we question a question. So the T3 dropping significantly. Susie, if you want to give more depth on what that means, and if you want to mention more about your overall thyroid labs, I can give a more detailed answer. There are those who argue that your T3 must be on the high end of normal range, or else everything bad happens to you. And I've looked at the data around that, and I don't see strong evidence for it. I do see a lot of evidence that always having a high T3 is actually not a good thing. There's quite a bit of data saying that it equates to obesity, poor cardiovascular health, and other complications. It's just not how thyroid levels look in healthy people that lack thyroid disease. They tend to have more of a spectrum of T3 levels. So if yours went from like high normal to normal, I wouldn't consider that a problem. If that went way below range and your TSH went up, that's different. That would be a problem. But as a generalization, yes, adding in some version of estrogen can cause your body's thyroid needs to change. Now, thankfully, okay, I see you went from 4.3 to 2.4. Yeah, Susie, last 6 months, if you want to mention about other scores like your TSH, I can give more context. Healthy people can have a T3 of 2.4 if everything else is good. So it would depend upon the context. But yeah, this is what happens, is that any version of estrogen can make your body a little bit thyroid resistant. Now, thankfully, it's not a progressive issue, meaning that if it happens to you, it doesn't keep on going and going and going. It's somewhere around about 2-3 months to level out. And once it does level out, then your overall thyroid needs will stay steady as long as you have that estrogen in your system. So as long as you were to stay on the hormones, or if someone's on a contraceptive, same thing. But when a woman stops making hormones or goes off of one, then it changes back the other way. Okay, so Sue's TSH is 0.07. So this is exactly like the discussion that we had with Jackie. And Susie, I don't know if you came on recently, if you've been here for a little bit, but pretty much all the things I said to Jackie would make sense to you as well. When his TSH is below range, what that means is there's too much total thyroid hormone. And that interpretation is not changed by your T3 and T4 levels. There's some very rare cases to where the pituitary does not make enough TSH, and that can cause a low level of T3 and T4. But that's unusual, and that only occurs when the pituitary is shutting down across the board. And that causes very severe different patterns with all hormones. So ACTH, LH, IGF, they're all completely unusual. It's not subtle. What's much, much more common is that when the TSH is low, and Susie, I'm assuming you're taking thyroid, in those cases when the TSH is low, it just means that your body's got too much. And the T3 and T4, wherever they are, is where your body is trying to put them as it's getting rid of thyroid hormone. So yeah, they're really not the needle you need to move. The needle you need to move first off is just getting your TSH back up to a safe, normal range. Suze, if you want to have a conversation and let me know about what kind of medicine on, what amounts, I'm happy to give you more insights like I did for Jackie. So I'll keep tabs on that for follow-up comments. You're on Instagram, it looks like. Some related questions here. I need to get my TSH higher, but whenever they change my dose and add T3, I start with a lot of hyposymptoms first week. Is it possible that first week you feel worse and then you start feeling better? How can I know what my best dose is to get my TSH back up? So this is from Jim, J-I-M, it starts out with that. Yeah, if Jim, I'm not sure if it's Jim or not, but if you'd like to talk about your approximate body size, gender, whether you're on hormones, whether you're menstruating, I can talk to you about how much your body would make normally. But to answer your question though, yes, it can take a little while to feel normal again. So also, if you weren't here when I was speaking to Jackie, you may revisit some of that when the recording goes up. I talked about how when your TSH is low, your body is fighting thyroid. Your body is trying to resist it. Your body is getting rid of it faster. Your body is packaging it up so it makes it inactive, and your cells are blocking it from coming in. So it's really common to feel like you've got too little, even when you've got too much. And the way in which that works, if you lower your dose even in a way you should, it can take several weeks before your body recalibrates. So imagine that you're fighting thyroid and now you've got less thyroid. Well, if at first you might feel even more hypo, so those symptoms can worsen at first for some people. That's not lasting too terribly long. What can happen also is that someone can be on too much thyroid, and the extra thyroid is making them not have symptoms they otherwise would. Maybe they're fatigued from some other cause, but they're taking a lot of extra thyroid. In that case, the fatigue may not be as obvious, even if it still really would be there. They're just not feeling it. So when they lower their thyroid to a reasonable range, now the fatigue is more obvious again. So that can happen. But yeah, it can just take some time for the body to level out. That also can occur. But that's not a very long time. Okay, one more. uh, Doctor, can I book an appointment with you soon because the appointments are far away? Yeah, so appointments, couple of options clinically. So I don't do direct patient care these days. I mostly do the writing and the management. I've got 3 awesome doctors at Integrative Health. We work with people in 6 states right now. I'm not sure if I can get the 6 states right. Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon. I'm not totally certain. I'm pretty sure Utah's in the mix. But yeah, we work in several states via telemedicine, and we can manage all facets of thyroid care. They take care of that really well. I've done some consults. I did some consults this last year to where I did second opinion consults. And those are ones in which I didn't take over someone's case. I didn't prescribe for them, but I went through all their situation in great detail and basically said, here's what I would suggest, and talked about things they could then implement with their doctor back home. So those are the thyroid second opinions. That's at thyroidsecondopinion.com. Those are booked out through roughly March. I think I've got some appointments in March, and I think then they're paused again for a little while. Like March and April, I think they've got a few appointments open. Those are the soonest ones. My apologies, but those are the next ones that are available for personally talking with me. If I can help in any way here now and answer some basic questions, I'm glad to do so. I know I'm not here next week, but I will be the week after as well. Okay, a little more depth on Sue's. Let's talk about this one. On 75 tyrosine, 25 milligrams. Okay, so Sue's, I'm gonna call you out on this. It just freaks me out when people say milligram and they need microgram. What you're doing is completely harmless. No one will be hurt by that, but I can't get it out of my head because a pharmacist that I knew of once made that mistake and almost killed someone. So these are micrograms, or mcg. They're not milligrams. That's 1,000 times different. That's my OCD pet peeve. So you're on 75 micrograms, I'll assume, of tyrosine and 25 micrograms of T3. 3 days a week, I take a 2 NDT dose, 25 milligram T3. So Suze, I don't know what the 2 ND dose 25, I don't understand what you mean by that. And if you could clarify that for me, I'll add that in. Okay, correct, I saw that, but I don't know what the 2 ND dose. Oh, unless you mean you just take two of the T3 pills. So if you take one of the 25 microgram T3 pill, 3 days, second dose. Okay, take a 2 ND per second. That makes perfect sense. Yep, I'm kind of slow with things sometimes. Okay, so 3 days a week, take a second dose. Okay, let's do the math for you here. So you run 75 of tyrosine, which is T4, so that's just 75. And then the T3, so I said before when I was speaking with Jackie that T3, it's about 4 times the potency of T4. So the 25 of T3, we'll call that 100 of T4 to make it in common units. So you do that on 4 days a week. So then on 3 days a week, you're taking basically 200 of the T4 from T3, if that makes sense. So let's do the math on those two. And all together, so you're getting 175 on the days you take 1 T3, and you're getting 275 on the days you take 2. So between the two of those, you're getting roughly 215. So it's around 215, 220 micrograms of T4 equivalency. So that's about what that looks like if it were in T4 units. And now the other thought is, you said that your TSH is 0.07. So that 215 micrograms of T4, for example, if a woman was, say, 200, and I'm doing some quick math, if a woman was 230 pounds and she was menstruating or on hormone replacement, she would need about that much thyroid to break even. So if you're less than 230 pounds, then we would expect you to need less thyroid than that. So you're taking a lot of stuff. You're taking a pretty whopping dose overall. And you're taking a 1-to-3 ratio of T4 to T3 on the days you take 1 T3, and you're taking a higher dose on the other days. So the ratios of T3 to T4 you're taking are unusual. They're much, much higher than typical. And the dose you're taking is pretty high for an average size adult. So it wouldn't be surprising to see the TSH below range. And that can make people not feel well. So really the first thing that a doctor would do in regulating that is having you take a dose that would make sense for your body size and get your TSH into a safe, normal range. Once that's happened, then it can be time to polish T3 and T4 levels. Then it's time to say, well, are these ratios right? Is your body using them properly? And if not, it's rarely a matter of changing the medication. It's more a matter of helping your body use it more effectively. It's more a matter of how your liver is working, your adrenal function, your micronutrient status. It's more so secondary factors that give rise to regulating T3 and T4 once you have the right amount of both to work with. So yeah, hope that was useful. Okay, Dr. C, I've been with you guys. I've been talking really fast for quite a while. I'm going to go start getting supper going tonight. It's going to be a simple London broil tonight. I didn't do as much preparation as typical. I was going to make a roast, but I didn't get that in the oven when I wanted to this morning. So instead, it'll be a London broil with some baked potatoes and a salad. Pretty simple Midwest sustaining food. And I'll be with you guys again 2 weeks out. Thanks again to Jackie for playing full on and having some really good questions and sharing information so we could all learn from that. And thanks to you all for joining me. Take great care, and I'll see you all really soon. Bye-bye. You know, I had just closed off, and I wasn't seeing comments come up properly before, but I saw a couple quick ones I'll give some brief answers to from the YouTube audience. So this is to Valerie. And Valerie, how can I lower reverse T3? Should I take selenium with my T4? Valerie, I do encourage selenium, and I encourage a good dose of that through the diet and through supplementation. Lowering T3, please Google Alan Christensen and just T3. There's a 16,000 word article I wrote about that. The short answer is it's usually a matter of taking too much thyroid, or it's some other health issue, or it's not relevant. And the blog that you'll find talks all about that in crazy, crazy detail. I hope you find that useful. And as far as selenium with T4, so to be really precise, you should take selenium at some point, not at the same time you take your T4. And not because there's some way in which T4 is bad without it, but because selenium is good for many, many reasons, including how your body can use thyroid hormones. So you should take it, but not at the same time. And one more quick one from YouTube. Do you have familiarity with hypopituitarism, Tiffany? Yes, Tiffany, I do. Sorry, I'm about to sign out. If you want to drop back in 2 weeks, I can talk about that in more detail if you ask about that again. If you even want to join on Instagram, I could pull you in live and talk about that. If we're talking about thyroid disease, there's a lot of cases where doctors think someone has hypopituitarism and they really don't. But it certainly can happen. So if someone does have a low output from their thyroid, their adrenals, their ovaries, if all the glands are down, hypopituitarism certainly does happen. And happy to give some more detailed answers if you've got more detailed questions 2 weeks out. All right, take care. Bye-bye.